all of my videos are way too long. So I'm making a video that forces me to have shorter thoughts and not speak for 2 hours to get my point across. I have a lot of things I want to say, and I might record videos for each of these things that are way longer, but I want to put them all here before I forget about any of them. The reason that I'm doing this video is because I've noticed a trend in debate where people are way too dogmatic, and I think that people have very strong beliefs that align with what everyone else thinks, and they don't think too critically about why. And the worrying trend is like, people are imposing these beliefs on others, sort of arbitrarily. Like the amount of judges whose paradigms say, I will vote against you automatically if you paraphrase, or if you don't disclose, is ridiculous. Like, when did this become something that was so much of a consensus that people are just willing to auto-vote on it? It's ridiculous. I don't think that this dogmatism should be imposed upon debaters at all. And so I'm going to give you 11 takes that I believe right now. There are two caveats. Number one, the way that you should think about this is like, I could put these in my paradigm and say I will auto-vote on these things. And then we would have some trouble if there's another person who auto-votes on the opposite. And so maybe that should cause you to introspect a little bit. Like, why is it legitimate for them to put their opinion as an auto-voting issue in their paradigm, but not for me to do it? If we were both on a panel together, what would happen? Seems like clearly this is untenable, so neither of us should be dogmatic enough to put them in our paradigm. Second thing is, in the name of epistemic modesty, I'm not going to say that all of these things are true. I am a new man. I have a new haircut. I have new nails. I can try on things as I want. Just like I can try on new opinions as I want, and then maybe tomorrow I'll think something different. So I shouldn't put these in my paradigm and like impose them upon all of the students that I judge to sway the norms of PF and the direction that I want them to go in. Because I might completely change my mind. Maybe someone comments in the description of this video and they tell me that actually here are 10 reasons why take number 5 is completely wrong. Maybe I agree with all of those and then I change take number 5. I think this is something that we should encourage more. I don't know why more people don't have one opinion and then change it later and admit that they were wrong before. This should also be a norm in debate. I don't know why I haven't seen that more. It's okay to admit that you were wrong. So without further ado, I'm going to do 11 different takes that I currently feel very strongly about, but I'm willing to change. But I'm going to word them as strongly as possible. To prevent me from making this a 2-hour video, I will only speak about these takes during the duration of a handstand. Those of you who know me quite well know that I am capable of doing handstands. This is a pretty severe limitation. I don't know how long I'll be able to talk, especially when it comes to like, the 5th or 6th or 7th handstand I have to do in a row. So hopefully the goal is that this will limit the amount of space that I have to make thoughts, so I'll be required to be very efficient. Also, Amadea, who is doing the camera work, thank you very much, Amadea, will have a little chance to respond to each of these takes afterwards, which further incentivizes me to really get to the point early when I'm doing these handstands. You, the audience, should think critically about who you think is right. And if we both agree on it, you should think about why maybe you disagree. If we disagree on it, think about what you think. It might be a third opinion. It might be aligned with one of our opinions. But the point of this is just like encourage you to think with your brain. And if your response to any of these is like, that's just how it is, stop. That's not what I want. That's the whole point of what I'm trying to get rid of. So no more of that. I think we should fight against the inertia around norms in debate right now. Therefore, think with your brain. Just to be clear, I only get one take to do this, so if I mess up, no going back. The title of this take is Neither Spec nor Topicality are voters in PF. Okay, let's try this. I haven't tested this, so we're going to see how this even works. All right.
The NSDA rules say that there are no plans or counterplans in PF, which means that it doesn't make sense for the app to be able to specify any implementation. If they can, then the neg should have an equal burden to specify implementation. Instead, both of them should probably debate about the most probable implementation of the topic, because there's no plans or counterplans. So how are you to specify anything? Topicality is not a voter for the same exact reason, because why is it a voter? Because it's just defense. Of course, you can't get offense off of a non-topical position, but if you say it's non-topical, that should be the end of the story. Then they just go for the other positions that are topical. For example, if the entire app is non-topical, they should just read new offense in the next speech that is a constructive speech, like the rebuttal, and then just say that that's topical and then go for that. But it's not. There's no reason why it ought to be a voter, because they don't control what you can or cannot say, because they don't focus the entire debate around a specific plan of advocacy. They just, both sides are whole res, so it doesn't make sense for topicality to be a voter in the first place. If it is a voter, then it's a voter against both the AF and the neg equally, because they're entirely symmetric. This is why the neg can speak first in PF, for example, because they're pros and cons, not AF and neg. Those are words that are imported from policy, which assumes a plan that is given by the AF, which is why these norms have been implemented in PF, but they've been implemented incorrectly without regard for the actual rules and norms of PF that are, that are actually PF specific. Okay.
I agree that Spec isn't a voter, not only in PF, but also in other debate events, just because I think that non-resolutional theory overall doesn't make sense, and that's an example of that. But I disagree with the topicality part of it. I think it is a voting issue. For example, if a debater wants to read a specific plan in the constructive, and that's not topical, then you would read topicality against that. And that can include the argument that it should be whole res. I guess that would be an additional theory argument, saying that the rules of PF make it so that you can't read plans. And I'm not sure how I would feel about that. I think that that is more of a debatable question than Spec would be, at least, because that would be in the PF handbook, so there is some sort of basis for it ahead of time. But I do think that Matt kind of assumes an ideal world where nobody will read plans at all in the first speech, but if that does happen, I think it makes sense to read topicality and not allow them to read new advocacies in the rebuttal, because you shouldn't bring up new arguments in a rebuttal speech. It's called a rebuttal for a reason, which means that it wouldn't make sense to switch advocacies. I think that this might be different in policy. I would be more okay with somebody coming up with a new topical plan in the 2AC, just because that's also a constructive speech, but given the structure of PF, the rebuttal specifically designated as that, then I don't think I would be okay with a new advocacy. And so I think the topicality would make sense and be a voting issue, because people shouldn't just be allowed to change their advocacies afterwards.
The title of this one is Judges Should Not Read Speech Docs or Evidence Unless Contested.
Judges should never read speech docs, because this completely increases the gap of comprehension between the judges and the debaters on the other side. For example, the debaters on the other side might be able to also get the speech docs, but they don't only have a limited amount of time to actually prepare and read the speech docs. But the judges can read the speech docs whenever the heck they want. They can read speech docs during the cross or prep time or other people's speeches or after the round. For example, some judges take 15 minutes after the round to comb through the speech docs and then retroactively change their understanding of the arguments, which the other debaters on the other side don't have the privilege of doing, which means this allows for the sneakiest possible strategies that are infinitely abusive, because you can trick the other team but you don't have to trick the judge, because the judge will go back and read very thoroughly to completely understand the argument before they vote. Bad. They should also not read any of the evidence unless it's contested. Why are you reading the evidence? Are you rewarding them for better evidence? That just seems like intervention, because they have slightly better evidence that is subjectively determined to be better. How are you determining that it's better if it's not an argument that's made in the round? The only time you should ever be looking at the evidence is if there's a disputed question about the evidence in the round made by the debaters. If they're not saying that, then the only possible reason you could be reading the evidence is to intervene in some way, because they have slightly better evidence that slightly leans you towards them. That's not a technical way to vote in any paradigm.
I partially agree with this take. I do think that judges read evidence way too often and make the decision based on the evidence alone and not the actual arguments that were made around the evidence. However, I think this entire debate hinges on the definition of the word contested. I think that evidence is not necessarily just contested when one debater says you've miscut that card or you're lying. Instead, sometimes they make arguments weighing the quality of their evidence against each other's, and then in that case, it makes sense for the judge to read it and verify that what they're saying is actually true. So I think that I would be okay with judges reading evidence in more circumstances than Mac is, but I still think that they read it too much in the status quo.
The title of this one is It is Cheating to Read Any Prep That You or Your Partner Did Not Do. Okay, let's see. I don't know. I'm deteriorating physically quite rapidly, so we'll see how this goes. But I want to justify this one. Okay.
Copying other people's work is the single greatest threat to debate, including PF. It is very prevalent in PF nowadays. This is why I think people should stop doing all of that. It is cheating to read your coach's prep as your own. Even if you don't read it as your own and you cite them or whatever, that's still cheating. You're literally paying money for someone else to write your speech. Do it yourself. You're supposed to be critically thinking. You're supposed to be a debater. What are you doing? How are you just paying someone else to write all of your speeches for you? That sounds like the death of debate to me, but it goes beyond just reading your coach's prep to everyone else's prep as well. You will always get less out of the activity if you read someone else's prep, and I also think it literally is unfair. The people who just happen to cut all of the other people's prep the most win the most. Maybe it's not unfair, but it's certainly uneducational. You should do your own work, you fools. And I think there are arguments for why you should not have the burden of doing it all yourself, but paraphrasing seems to solve this. I'm okay with you using other people's evidence as long as you recut it or you paraphrase it yourself. I think that makes it okay. You can still take inspiration from everyone else you talk to. Just don't read word for word the same arguments that they wrote for you. That sounds like plagiarism.
I think it would be good if people did their prep more often, but first off, I think this is kind of an unenforceable rule because people can just steal each other's cards and then take out the initials or just steal cards that don't even have initials on them in the first place, and then you wouldn't be able to put a check on that. Also, I think it would disadvantage people who've had more partners because if you're allowed to read a prep that any of your partners has produced, then if you had 10 partners and somebody else has had one, then you're able to read much more prep. So it doesn't really make sense to enforce this in the context of the round, and it randomly disadvantages some debaters over others. Also, I do think it's good for novices or people with less experience to read the prep of others because then they learn how an argument is actually supposed to be formatted and they can extend it that way. Because if they read their own prep, but their own prep makes absolutely no sense because they don't have that much experience in debate, then they learn less out of going for it because they're learning how to go for arguments wrong. And so I do think there's a value in reading your coaches or your older teammates' prep, and it also allows you to read way more arguments than you would otherwise be able to. For example, if you go on the wiki and you steal other teams' prep, then you're able to learn how to go for arguments that you might not necessarily produce yourself, that might teach you more about the activity and the topic overall. I don't think that plagiarism is that much of a concern because when something is uploaded on the wiki, then it becomes the common property of anyone. It's not necessarily one person owns it, but I do think that there is already an incentive to recut the prep yourself because if you want to win rounds off it, then you need to understand it well, and recutting it is part of that.
The title of this one is No Judges Have the Jurisdiction to Vote on Anything That Did Not Happen in the Debate Round. Okay, give me 1 second. Okay.
Anything that did not happen in the debate round is unverifiable, and also if the judges are allowed to vote on things that didn't occur in the debate round, it creates really weird norms where you could just be like, look, I have this video of this dude doing this really terrible stuff, so you should cancel them in this debate round and like drop them for some reason. This means that this probably includes disclosure practices. It's not the judge's job to determine who did better things before or after the round. Their only role is to determine who wins this specific debate round, and stuff that you did before or after doesn't count.
I'm not sure we got that much of a warrant there, but I do agree that most out-of-round violations just aren't verifiable or don't make that much sense. For example, when someone pulls something that someone said a million years ago and then brings it up as a reason to vote against them, I'm not a fan of that. I also think that in general, non-resolutional theory is bad because it's unpredictable and arbitrary and can't set norms because it's not based on anything that you had going in before the round. I think the one exception to this is disclosure theory though, if it's been in a tournament invitation, because then people knew that that was the rule ahead of time and that they had to follow it. And we can verify that because we have screenshots of people not disclosing on the wiki, so that solves the verification problem.
Okay, this is number 5. The title of this is Extensions Should Not Be Required in Later Speeches. Okay. Oh god.
I think it is arbitrary that judges require you to repeat your arguments and explain them again in later speeches. Why do they do this? I actually don't know that this is a thing in policy. Amadea is going to have a different interpretation of the word extension than I do because I come from public forum. Extension to me does not include defending your arguments. It's just explaining them again from top to bottom. I don't know why it is required that summary and final focus must completely remake the wheel on your argument. Why do they have to do this? Your argument exists regardless of if you completely remake it in in those speeches, and you don't have to completely remake it in rebuttal under existing PF norms. So why does summary have to do it, but rebuttal doesn't? It doesn't make sense. The argument is still there, even if you don't completely explain it again.
I agree that you shouldn't have to say every single part of the argument when you extend it, because if it hasn't contested, then it doesn't matter anymore. But I think that you should be extending the impact, because that's what the judge is going to be voting on. If you don't say anything about the argument later on, I think it's fair for the other team to just assume that you've dropped it. It doesn't matter to you, and so it shouldn't matter to them either, and they shouldn't have to respond to it. But I do think that if you extend an argument by just extending the impact and then responding to whatever your opponent said against it, then that should be fine. That meets the threshold for what an extension is in my book. And I think in most policy judges' books, I don't really know why PF judges expect you to extend every single part of the argument. That sounds kind of arbitrary, because does that mean you have to say every card name? Does that mean you have to say every single line that you said in the 1AC? I'm not really sure. I think as long as you're making it clear that you're going for this argument and you're explaining what the impact is to the judge so they can vote on it, then that should be sufficient.
Title of this one?
The title of this one is
No rest time.
Durable fiat doesn't make sense. Okay, here goes nothing.
Durable fiat makes no sense. It has no application to real-world debates about policy, because people don't assume that their policy is going to last infinitely into the future, especially when the next administration comes. In fact, they probably assume that it might be reversed, which often happens because that's what actually happens in the real world. So why are we living in this magical world where policies stick around forever? It doesn't make any sense. There are lots of topics in which it doesn't make any sense either for the policy to be so sticky, especially if we have the fiat on the other side as well. Oh man.
I think if we said that durable fiat didn't exist at all, then most of the policies that we would be proposing would be overturned right away, because the current administration wouldn't agree with it in most cases. And it doesn't make sense to say that we can assume that the current administration agrees with it and then the next one doesn't, because that erases all the real world concerns. Because if you're trying to be as realistic as possible, then why would your concerns about the next administration not apply to the current one? I also think that nothing in the actual resolution says that we should, I don't know. I think that in general, the resolution isn't specific to a political administration. So for example, if the topic is the US should increase the minimum wage, then nothing about it says the Trump administration should increase the minimum wage. It just says that that should happen in general. So in fact, I don't think that there is necessarily a time constraint on that, which is why I think that in general, it's okay to be talking about this policy happening a little bit in the future, just because that's how any normal person would interpret the statement, the US should do something. It's not contextual to that administration. So I think this is the most textual to what people are actually talking about when they talk about the resolution.
The title of this one is that we should not be calling PF speeches by their equivalent names in policy. For example, the 1AC.
Oh, look at you! You are so cool! You understand policy debate, you understand LD debate, you're not just a filthy PFer, you understand the other technical formats as well. But guess what? Those formats are not PF. PF rules are different than the other formats, and PF speeches have unique roles that they fill that are entirely different from the other speeches that are equivalent or near equivalence in the other formats. This only creates a distortion and what is that word?
Obfuscates?
This obfuscates the role of the speeches in PF, and it encourages a trend of trying to imitate policy in ways that fail, in ways that are antithetical to the actual structures that exist in PF. And we should instead recognize that speeches are unique.
I agree with this one.
The title of this take is that people should be allowed to request that the round has no spreading. Okay.
Speed reading or spreading is not necessarily a bad thing in debate inherently, but it can be really bad if someone doesn't want to do it. I think that you don't need to prove that you have accessibility accommodations in order to request that you don't want spreading the round, because sometimes it's really difficult to be granted those accommodations, and this kind of stuff is very fuzzy, so I think it's okay for someone to say, I don't want any spreading in this round, and then everyone agrees and listens to them. I think this could be binding, and it would be pretty cool. Maybe the result is that people do it every time they think they might get beaten by spreading, but I think that would even be okay.
I agree with this one in PF because I don't think PF should have spreading to begin with because it should be a lay debate event. That's how it was created, and the structure of the speeches best promotes that. It doesn't make sense for there to be any spreading there at all, and so I think the judges could just automatically drop any teams that spread. I would even be okay with that. I don't agree with this in LD or policy because I think that spreading is kind of an inherent feature of those activities. It allows you to get more arguments in and go more in depth on those arguments. It's been ingrained in those activities for a long period of time. Many decades, and I think that if somebody can automatically request that you don't spread in a debate, then that's bad because it's a way for them to just get an advantage if they feel like they're not fast enough. But this would be the same thing as, for example, if you were in a swimming competition and you were like, well, I think I'm better at using my arms and my legs. That means that nobody can use their legs when they swim. I do think that spreading is a feature of debate that is important to it. And allows you to make the sorts of arguments that you do, and so it wouldn't make sense to arbitrarily allow people to cut it out like that. Also, one more thing to add to buy Mac a little more time while he rests is that there's no way to enforce this just because there's no definition for what spreading actually is. Is it like 200 words per minute? Is it 300 words per minute? And you also can't measure that during the round. And I think that some people even sound slower when they speak faster than other people who actually speak slower but sound like they're spreading. And so it's hard to be able to find the specific words per minute to cut that off at, or to be able to even enforce that even if you do have that line. And so it just doesn't make sense as a policy that you would put in a round.
Disclosure theory makes no sense and should not be voted on in most rounds. If you have good responses, it's easy to have good responses. Okay.
Okay, even if you think that disclosure is a good practice for education, I might not. There are reasons that are pretty valid on both sides. For example, I think that disclosure has created a lot more copying, which leads to less critical thinking. Maybe you think that it's more educational than non-educational, but you can't ever know for sure. And we might have different subjective preferences for which parts of education we care most about, and neither of us can ever be verifiably correct because this is a subjective question. Don't force me into your specific norms that you like better because I might not. Also, any theory that says you must be more educational is kind of silly. Where is the end? Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. There's never an end point.
I think the question of whether disclosure is good is different from the question of whether disclosure theory is good. So let's start with the disclosure one. I think that disclosure is obviously good because otherwise schools that have a lot of connections are going to be able to get other people's cases no matter what. And so if you put it on the wiki, at least everybody can get it equally. So it equalizes the playing field. You don't want to further advantage the wealthy big schools who already have those advantages in the first place. And also when you have disclosed cases, you can better prepare strategies. For example, you can do counterplan or disad research ahead of time and be able to craft really creative strategies that are unique to that case in ways that you wouldn't if you were just heard the case for the first time in the round and were just trying to apply all of your generics to it. And I think that copying evidence can actually be good because first, it increases the number of arguments that you can have, especially if you're from a small school. And second, it also forces you to learn more about the topic because you have more arguments that you can go really in depth on. Now, on the question of disclosure theory itself, I'm 50-50 on this one because I think it is an example of non-resolutional theory, which is bad because you can't predict it ahead of time. But I think that if it is in the tournament invite, that helps check for that because it establishes a rule that everybody knows that they have to follow. If it isn't, I think I'm 50-50 on this because I do strongly believe that disclosure is good as a practice, but I am sympathetic to the people who just say that you're trying to establish arbitrary norms. And I definitely dislike the disclosure interps that are very specific, like you have to include round reports on the wiki, or you have to also include cites in addition to including open source. I think that's just a little silly because if the case is there, it's there.
Paraphrasing is okay and maybe good. Okay.
I have witnessed the quality of education at PF fall precipitously after paraphrasing is no longer a norm. Yes, it's true that people can misrepresent evidence when they're paraphrasing, but they can also do the same thing when they have actual cut cards. And I've seen this on the wiki. You can look at any case on the wiki right now and see how badly people misrepresent their evidence. It's still a problem. But here's the thing. It's in the rules that you're allowed to paraphrase, so you're not allowed to tell me what I am or am not allowed to do if it is in the rules that I'm allowed to do it. Who are you to make this subjective judgment? Even if you think it's more educational, maybe I don't. Again, same argument as before.
I agree that paraphrasing is okay in PF rounds that operate the way PF was intended to, so lay PF rounds. I think if it's more of a tech round, then you shouldn't be paraphrasing, because just think about how awful it is to listen to people spreading through paraphrased evidence. That is very hard to respond to. You can't even hear the words behind the evidence. It does strike me as quite uneducational, because the evidence is just going through so fast and you can't actually stop and look at the cards while they're reading it, which all seem to be pretty important components of technical debate. However, in lay debate, I think that paraphrasing is fine. It's the way that you would make arguments when talking to people in the real world, which is something that lay debate should also kind of align with. So it makes sense to me.
Okay, this is the last one. I'm really going to try to hold this one as long as possible. Title is "The NSDA rules control almost everything." Okay. All right, let's see. Let's see if I can put this together. Okay.
Okay, the NSDA rules should be assumed by default if the tournament is using public forum and awards NSDA points. Maybe they have other carve-outs. If the tournament invitation says anything other than the NSDA rules or anything in contrast to the NSDA rules, you prefer the tournament invitation. But if it doesn't say something about a specific rule in the NSDA handbook, you don't assume nothing. You assume the NSDA handbook because it made public forum and it defines what public forum is as an activity in the first place. This is important because the NSDA rules allow for things like paraphrasing, and this is the most predictable source of rules that you can have. But it's not only predictability, it's also the jurisdiction of the judge. The definition of public forum debate is in the NSDA rules. If you vote on anything that's not in the NSDA rules, then it's not the definition of public forum.
I agree with this. I think the rules define the activity and everyone had them ahead of time, so they should just be expected to follow them unless the tournament invitation says anything different.
Okay, I didn't really get to explain myself very much, which I guess is the point, but I hope that you got something from this. At the very least, this should make you think a little bit. You should not accept any of these takes blindly, and you should especially question the beliefs that you have that align the most with the other people around you, because often those are the beliefs that you have the fewest actual reasons for. Now, the temptation is to find reasons for these after assuming the belief is true. I think instead you should steelman the opposite case. You should try to find as many reasons why the opposite of your belief is true as possible and genuinely consider them, not just like find them all in order to write responses to them, you know? And if you can do this, you will have better norms. This is the whole process of dialectics. This is what it means to engage in dialectics and think about things critically instead of just assuming a position. We're taught to assume a position in debate because we are either on the pro or the con, but you don't have to do that with norms. Thanks for watching.